Thank you, Emmy. Max Thornton holds a PhD in Theological and Philosophical Studies in Religion from Duke University. His research focuses on queer and trans studies in religion, disability, crypt theory, feminist science, and technology studies. He previously held a visiting position at Drake University in Iowa and currently teaches at Keene University in New Jersey. Please welcome Max Thornton.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. I'm Max. I am a white man who is not tall. I have short, curly, dark hair, and glasses, and I'm wearing a shirt with pink flamingos on it, and rainbow shoes. So this talk is it stems from the research I did for my dissertation, but I've taken it in sort of a slightly different direction based on some other research I've been doing lately. And I've also tried to avoid being too dense or dry. So there's not a lot here of specific scholars, philosophers, theologians, theory. I'm happy to get into that stuff in the Q&A if people are very interested, but I'm trying to keep it engaging for first thing in the morning on the last day of the conference. So I've titled the talk, Theology, Disability, and the Transgender Child. So far in 2024, at least 586 anti-trans bills have been introduced in state houses all across the US. That's more than in the whole of 2023, and it was over 500 last year as well. Some of these bills target drag shows and performance. Some ban trans people from participating in sports or using certain bathrooms. Some limit access to books or websites with information about transgender people's existence. But the most controversial topic is undoubtedly that of children's access to transgender medical care. Oh, sorry. Are we doing okay technologically? I know the struggle. Okay, so hopefully we're good. So, many well-meaning people who broadly support LGBTQ+ rights are nevertheless uncomfortable with the idea of a child medically transitioning to a different gender. In this talk, I want to address this discomfort. I believe that transgender children do confront us with some profound theological questions about the nature of childhood, of gender, of medical intervention, and ultimately of personhood itself. Anti-trans legislation does not help us address these questions. Instead, it shuts them down, ultimately reinforcing an idea of humanity that is both gender restrictive and ableist. My two goals in this talk are first to demonstrate the ableism of this theology that lies behind attacks on trans children, and secondly, to propose a more constructive, better theology to take its place, one that might allow us to engage productively with these deep questions of how to create and maintain a world in which all children have space to flourish. Before going any further, I want to define some terms so that everyone knows what I'm talking about. And please, if I use a confusing or specialized term without defining it, without making it clear, please somebody raise a hand and let me know. So I have a little slide here with some definitions. This is my wordiest slide. I've tried to keep them less wordy on the whole, so I apologize for that. So probably all know this one, that if you're a transgender, or trans for short, you're a different gender from the one that you were assigned at birth. You were born, they said, okay, this is a girl or this is a boy, and you live as something different now. That could be a man, a woman, non-binary, fluid. There are a lot of options here. If you're not trans, you are cisgender or cis. I'm defining that here as you're the same gender as the one you were assigned at birth. This is somewhat of an oversimplification. I'm actually writing a book on this, and so I have a lot of thoughts about it being much more complicated than this, but for my purposes today, I think this will do as a definition, that cisgender people are people who are not trans, who are the same gender that everyone thought they were when they were born. Transition is the act of changing your gender. This is often broken down into two parts. Social transition, this is changing the social aspects, asking people to use a different name for you, asking people to use different pronouns for you, perhaps changing the way you present to the world, often in terms of changing your hair, changing your clothes, that kind of thing. Medical transition refers to changing your body medically, usually using hormones or getting surgery. Hormones cause puberty. Testosterone causes typically male puberty. Estrogen causes a typically female puberty. All humans have both testosterone and estrogen in our bodies. It's really just about the different ratios and levels. So it depends which one is more predominant in your body affects how you will develop. Medical transition for children often starts with puberty blockers. These are drugs that temporarily pause puberty. And when you stop taking blockers, you will go through puberty. And these are a couple of words I am going to be using briefly, I think. Puberty can be caused either by taking exogenous hormones, hormones added to your body from an outside source, or from endogenous hormones, which are the ones your body produces by itself. Some of the effects of hormones are irreversible, while others are not. Puberty blockers are entirely reversible. They just kind of put things on pause. And they're also taken by children who are not transgender if they have the condition precocious puberty, where you start puberty at a very, very young age, sometimes as young as 5 or 6. Nobody wants a child to go through puberty at that age, and it is definitely not good for them. So they take these blockers, and then when they get to an appropriate age for puberty, they can stop taking them. So those are my definitions, and this PowerPoint should be available for you in the folder if you want to download it and refer back to them. So I included a slide for my gender definitions, but I also want to talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about disability. In this room, in this space, in this conference, we all know that disability is not the same as inability. We all know that we should presume competence. We all know that disabled people deserve to receive accommodations and should have their access needs met. But we also know that we live in a very ableist world, and ableism presumes the opposite. It refuses to provide accommodations. It presumes incompetence. One of the things I'm going to be talking about here is the idea that ableist structures incapacitate people. If you are viewed as disabled, you are considered incapable. As we know, in a disability-centered space like this one, when a disabled person cannot do something, we first blame the ableism that failed to meet their access needs. But the broader world blames the disabled person for not being able to do it. Part of how this incapacitation works is through a self-perpetuating cycle of equating disability with incapacity. By refusing to accommodate people's access needs, the ableist world actually makes people incapable and keeps them that way. A wheelchair user may be unable to walk down the stairs to the New York subway, but they're not inherently unable to use the subway. It's the structural and policy decision not to provide elevator access that makes them unable to use it. But ableism only acknowledges the first part. You can't go down the stairs, therefore you can't use the subway, and that is a you problem. I think I have a... Yeah, so I have a little... just a little illustration on this slide about how this process of incapacitation works. I've got three things connected by arrows, so they're going round as a circle that reinforces each other. So the presumption of incompetence leads to a lack of accommodation, which leads to incapacity, the inability to do something, which perpetuates this presumption of incompetence. So that's my little model of how I would say that this process of incapacitation works, that it is something that is done by refusing to presume competence and refusing to provide accommodations. Presuming competence is an important baseline rule of disability justice for a reason. It's a crucial element of restoring autonomy and self-determination to people who, in so many ways, have historically been denied the opportunity to make decisions about their own bodies and their own lives. At the same time, I think it's important for us to think seriously about certain states of being that complicate the meaning of self-determination. I'm going to be using the term cognitive impairment for these states. I'm not talking about the lived experiences of people with intellectual disabilities. I'm talking about the assumptions that an ableist society makes about the people that it incapacitates through assuming their incompetence and refusing to provide accommodations. So cognitive impairment refers to any state in which a person is deemed to have a diminishment of their reasoning skills and decision-making skills, whether temporarily or permanently. Later on, I'm going to trouble this definition and what it implies about normative cognitive function. But for now, I just want us to notice that very often this idea of cognitive impairment is how ableism justifies incapacitating people, whether those people are disabled, mentally ill, or children. Intellectually disabled people are almost entirely devalued by our society, and so associating someone with intellectual disability, whether or not they have one, is the fastest way to devalue them, unfortunately. So, with these definitions and ideas under our belt, we can begin to assemble the pieces of the argument. The first piece is the relationship between childhood and disability. Many disabled people know the frustrating experience of being infantilized, treated like a child even though you are a full-grown adult. People addressing your companion or carer instead of you. People talking down to you. People assuming you cannot be a sexual being. People refusing to trust that you know what's best for yourself. All of these are completely appropriate ways to treat a baby or a toddler, and completely inappropriate ways to treat an adult. In an ableist world, being a disabled adult often means being seen as a perpetual child. And this helps to reinforce the association of childhood with disability. It is another kind of reinforcing circle. Childhood is, in many ways, viewed as a kind of disability, a kind of cognitive impairment, but a temporary one that a child will eventually grow out of, at least if they're not otherwise disabled, since, as I just mentioned, many disabled people are not accorded the basic human dignity of being presumed to be fully capable adults. I think what's important about this is that there's obviously a kernel of truth to the notion that childhood is a temporary cognitive impairment. There are obvious ways in which children, especially babies, cannot have full self-determination. If you let your toddler choose their own dinner every night, it is highly unlikely that they will receive all the nutrients their body needs. Yet, as disability justice teaches us, needing support from a caretaker should not mean that they rule your life with an iron fist, and demanding full, unquestioning obedience from a child at all times certainly does not help them to develop the skills they will need as an adult. The question is, how do we best facilitate and support children's decision-making and their eventual transition to autonomy? In any situation, this is a very challenging question, and it gets even more complicated when it concerns something where people have vastly different ideas about what constitutes a good outcome, such as gender. So my next slide, I just have a little chart about this relationship between childhood and disability, where these things that stem from ableism are infantilization, incapacitation, and the presumption of cognitive impairment. Ableism puts these assumptions on children and also on anyone who is associated with children, particularly disabled people. This leads me to the next part of the argument, which is the idea that being transgender requires a certain intellectual capacity. It's not uncommon for people to think of gender transition as something you can choose to do once you are a sufficiently developed, sufficiently competent adult, rather like taking up smoking or getting a tattoo. I hear these analogies all the time from people who are uncomfortable with the idea of a child transitioning. Anyone who gave a child a cigarette or allowed their child to get a tattoo, no matter how much the child begged for it, would rightly be seen as abusive. And so the analogy is that this would also be the case for allowing your child to medically transition. You can choose what to do with your body once you are an adult, once you're 18, but under that age, tough luck. I'm hoping that this talk as a whole is going to demonstrate the inaptness, the unhelpfulness of this analogy. But for now, I really want to focus on this presumed relationship between capacity or competency and transness. The idea that you have to demonstrate a certain degree of cognitive competency in order to be allowed to be transgender. Mental illness, in particular, has often been viewed as a disqualification from competency as a form of cognitive impairment, and this has had a lot of complicated implications for trans people over the last 100+ years that medical transition has been available to people. There are two competing ideas here that both constrain trans people. One is the idea that you cannot transition if you have a mental illness, because that mental illness makes you incompetent to make a decision like that for yourself. And the other is that being transgender is itself a form of mental illness. If we look at this long history of medical transition over the past 100 years, it has been quite common to view this desire to be a different gender as inherently suspect, as a sign of mental illness and a sign of cognitive impairment in itself. There is something wrong with you if you want to change your gender. This is still the opinion of people who reject the reality of trans people's genders entirely, and people who promote the idea of conversion therapy, that if you just subject someone to enough therapy, you can convince them that they no longer wish to live as a different gender. For these people, if you view medical transition as self-evidently a bad outcome, the prescription is simple. No one should transition. If you want to transition, you should undergo counseling that will help you accept the reality of your body and gender as assigned at birth. Now, even if this was correct about the nature of gender and the desired outcome, and I don't agree that it is, proponents of this path are ignoring the simple fact that this kind of therapy doesn't work. Just as therapies aimed at changing a person's sexuality don't work, therapies aimed at changing a person's gender don't work. The most they can accomplish is enforcing repression, very profound repression, very psychologically and emotionally harmful repression. There is one thing that has been proved to alleviate the psychological and physical distress of experiencing gender dysphoria, and that is transitioning. And yet, many people want to keep the numbers of people transitioning to an absolute minimum, even though in our society, really not that many people express a desire to change their gender. Most people seem to be pretty happy going through life as one gender and not feeling the need to change it. But a certain number of people do express that desire, and we are told we cannot possibly let everyone who wants to transition do so. This seems to be the baseline of how our systems are set up, is that, okay, a certain number of people come to you and say, I want to change my gender. Well, we can't let them all do it. I have some theories about why, but for now, let's just follow the logic. If a certain percentage of society wants to change their gender, they can't all be allowed to do so, then how do we decide who can and who can't? Our solution has rested, I think, on this notion of capacity, of cognitive ability and function. Medical professionals have for a long time believed that they can draw this distinction between the people who are really transgender and people who mistakenly believe themselves to be transgender but are not really. I would say that this is a false division. There isn't anything. There's no sign, there's no marker, there's no blood test, there's no diagnostic criterion. There is nothing you can use to distinguish a really trans person from a not really trans person. If two people show up and they both say, I want to change my gender, there isn't anything that exists that you can use to sort them into, this person is correct about themselves and this person is wrong about themselves. Unfortunately, that has not stopped a lot of people from trying. For example, if we go back to the 1950s, it was essential that if you wanted to transition and change your gender, you had to end up being heterosexual. This was because homosexuality was defined as a form of psychological unwellness. It inherently disqualified you from transitioning. The idea that a person who was born seen as a girl, grew up and said, I would like to be a man, but I will be a gay man who is attracted to other men, that was inherently disqualifying. Part of being a man at this time, and still for many people, was being attracted to women. It was seen as part of gender, who you were attracted to. If you were a man who was not attracted to women, you were less of a man. If you were a woman who was not attracted to men, you were less of a woman. Part of what the gay rights movement has tried to do is decouple these things and say who a person is attracted to is not definitive of their gender. But for a long time, it was used to gatekeep who was really trans and who wasn't. If you could say, I will be a gender-conforming heterosexual person after my transition, you are much more likely to get approved. Now that homosexuality has gained broader acceptance in society, it's interesting that some anti-trans people have taken this argument and turned it around. They say that if transitioning would result in a heterosexual orientation, this is now unacceptable. They sometimes use the phrase, transing away the gay. You are taking a healthy gay person and turning them trans in order to make them heterosexual. I think there are a lot of flaws with this argument, but I think what is important right now is to notice that in both of these cases, the 1950s idea that we have to be heterosexual at the end, and the 2020s idea that you can't be heterosexual at the end, in both of these cases, a societal narrative about sexuality is more important than the trans person's own self-knowledge. By deviating from the social narrative about sexuality, trans people are told that this proves that their desire to transition cannot be trusted, and their self-knowledge is suspect. They are deemed incapable of making the correct decision about their gender, and someone else has to do it for them. Ironically enough, now that being trans is no longer officially defined as a mental illness in itself, there is a rush to blame people's transness on other mental illnesses. Some of the bills that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk require that anyone who wants to transition first has to be screened and treated for conditions like depression, anxiety, and autism. This suggests that one cannot be both depressed and transgender, or both autistic and transgender. Heaven forbid all three at once. Depression or autism is supposed to incapacitate someone, to make them incompetent to know whether or not they are transgender. If some people are really trans, others mistakenly believe that they are trans as a symptom of a different condition. Real transness is framed as a very rare disease, one whose symptoms might mimic those of other more common conditions, which have to be ruled out or treated before we dare consider that someone might really be trans. In our current moment, the increased visibility of transgender children in particular has resulted in an anxiety to differentiate between the really trans children and not really trans children. One of the most commonly cited statistics about transgender children that you may have come across is that 80% of them eventually desist. This is the language used to mean that they grow up and stop identifying as transgender. If this were true, and spoiler, it's not, there's a very important flaw in the data that led to this statistic, and I will reveal this shortly. If it was true, we could be forgiven for expending a lot of energy trying to make this distinction. Out of 5 transgender children standing in front of us, which one is really trans and which 4 are not really trans? And because our society defines childhood in this form of cognitive impairment, we would need additional scrutiny for making the decision in children rather than adults. Anyone who has a child in their life, or who even remembers what it feels like to be a child, knows that children are mercurial. They change their minds. Children often desire things that are bad for them. Children can be easily swayed and succumb to peer pressure. I forgot to go on to my next slide. So I have a little illustration here of this relationship between transness and capacity. I had too much fun with the smart art options in PowerPoint, so I apologize for my little illustrations, but this one is a little scale, and it's imbalanced, and on the side that is labeled not really trans, the weights read mentally ill, child, disabled. These are the things that disqualify you from being really trans. And on the side labeled really trans, the block says proven capable, but I ask the question how? How do you prove that you are capable of knowing your own gender if there are so many things that can disqualify you? So, as I was mentioning, that children change their minds, children want things that are bad for them, and children can be convinced they are subject to peer pressure. And these are perhaps the 3 biggest objections that you find to letting children transition. I'm calling them the arguments of permanency, negativity, and social contagion. I think if we probe these arguments a little more deeply, we find that they reflect really profound questions about the nature of human being. I think these are theological questions. So first, the objection of permanency. Have it up on the slide. Permanency raises the question, what is permanent and what is changeable? Which aspects of our identities, our being in the world, should be stable and which should be in flux? I think often when we talk about transition, we imagine it as sort of one movement, fairly straightforward, from one side to the other. Someone is a boy and they become a girl. Someone is a girl, they become a boy. But for many people, it's a lot more complicated than that. Some people are gender fluid and they experience changes in how they live and present their gender, perhaps even from day to day. Some people transition, decide it's not right for them, and detransition. Some people retransition again. I know at least one person, I've sort of lost count of how many times this person has gone back and forth about their gender. That's just what happens. Some people take a really long period of experimentation to figure themselves out, and some people never really do. I think the objection of permanency suggests that all of these are inherently bad things, but I think we can ask this question: are they really that bad? Many aspects of transitioning are reversible. It might get a little exhausting to remember if you have a friend who keeps changing their name. It's a little exhausting to remember every time what the new name is, but is it really such a bad thing? Does it harm anyone necessarily? So yeah, I've put up on the slide what is permanent and what is changeable, and how do we decide? I think it's also worth noting that much of this anxiety is about the idea that medical transition is irreversible, but I think that sometimes overstates the case a little bit. Many aspects of transitioning are reversible to at least some extent. I would note that the people who most commonly take exogenous hormones from outside of their body, are cisgender women going through menopause. Their bodies, like all of our bodies, undergo physical changes, some of which bring discomfort, some of which might bring pleasure, some of which might be managed and adjusted medically. But isn't that what having a body is? From birth to death, the body undergoes constant change. It seems that some people have a sense that the sex of people's bodies must be one thing that is unchanging and unchangeable. But I really do want to know why. What is so terrifying about a world in which the sex of people's bodies can change? And this brings us to the next objection, what I'm calling negativity. This assumption that transitioning is inherently a negative, a worst-case outcome, that every possible alternative should be exhausted before allowing it. Again, this is the idea that transition is a temptation, the cigarette that you won't allow your child to have, that you're raising them in hope that they won't ever desire it, even though you might admit that in adulthood they have the freedom to make choices with which you disagree. This assumption implies that the gender you are assigned at birth is more real, more basic, more natural, that any change you might make to your gender, even a change that is deeply felt and lived daily, is only a surface modification that doesn't really get at the underlying truth of your body. And also that being a different gender is primarily a matter of cognition and freely choosing to succumb to sinful temptation. I don't think any of these implications are warranted, and they certainly don't lead to the possibility of compassionate understanding and genuine conversations. If you're willing to begin by accepting trans people's narratives of their own lives, bodies, and genders, you can have much more fruitful discussions. Discussions which not only take the wide variation of gendered existence seriously, but also try to engage with multiple understandings, rather than preemptively rejecting the ones that disagree with your presuppositions. And a lot of these conversations are happening in trans and trans-affirmative spaces, and I think they're very interesting, and they don't necessarily have obvious answers. Questions like, is trans something you do or something you are? Are you expressing a pre-existing inner truth, or are you creating one as you go along? Is being trans an affliction, a gift, a transgression, a subversion, a fulfillment, an identity, a way of life? What happens if we honor the reality that different people experience transness differently? That being trans can be experienced as a blessing, a curse, a mundane fact of life, and perhaps even all three within the same day. And on the slide I have put, is transition really a worst-case scenario, and can gender be a calling, a gift, a fulfillment? Yet even those who might accept these arguments so far about permanence and negativity will still find that one of the most powerful arguments against childhood transition is the concept of social contagion. You may have encountered some version of this. This is the fear that being trans is a kind of transmissible infection, the COVID-19 of gender, perhaps. That children are particularly vulnerable to the contagion. Often, autistic children are particularly singled out. They're viewed, I guess, as doubly incapable of knowing their own minds, their own desires, and their own genders. They're children and they're autistic, so apparently that doubly disqualifies them. I would say the nastiest version of this fear of social contagion is framed around this idea of predation. This is the idea that LGBTQ people are grooming children in order to prey on them. But overall, the implication is that being trans, it's not a possibility of normal development. It's not one of the possible outcomes that can happen in a good life. Something someone had to intervene, something had to go wrong, something had to cause it. Just as visibly disabled people get asked, "What's wrong with you?" trans people get asked, "What's wrong with your gender? Why are you trans?" In both cases, we're being told, "You are a problem, and I demand an explanation." Social contagion is one explanation for transness, and it's an explanation that imagines a hostile world of infectious disease from which your child must be protected. But isn't humanity fundamentally social condition? Humans are social creatures. We communicate, we influence, we educate. All of these things do shape us profoundly. This social contagion argument is really pathologizing the social. And to pathologize the social is to pathologize being human. When we fear social contagion, could it be that what we really fear is facing the reality that we are all made into human beings through sharing and shared social worlds? What if we thought about gender the way we think about language acquisition or religious education, not as a deadly infection, but as a tradition that will inevitably be reshaped by those who inherited it, as a tool for growing and thriving into full humanity, even perhaps as a kind of gift? I promised to return to the 80% desistance statistic I mentioned above, the idea that when you study transgender children, 80% of them will grow up and grow out of it and will no longer be trans. The reason why this statistic is incorrect is because of how the study was conducted. The children in the study were not all transgender children, as we currently understand them. They were not children who expressed the desire to be a different gender. Most of the children in this study were children who engaged in what their parents saw as gender non-conforming behavior. These are the children who might have been defined as sissies or tomboys. And their parents were afraid of what this meant for their future, that they might grow up to be trans or be gay. And they wanted to intervene, so they brought them to the clinic and said, "Please help my child become gender normal." So that 80% statistic includes an awful lot of little boys who played with dolls but never said that they wanted to be girls. They never said that. They never expressed the desire to transition. It was just that the adults around them saw them behaving in ways that they thought were girly and said, "Okay, this is a problem. I need to stop it." Something missing from this whole framework of relying on medical professionals to distinguish between really trans people and not really trans people is listening to what people say they want. What if we've been going about this all wrong? What if instead of an ultimately fruitless quest to use science to distinguish the people who are really trans from the people who only think that they're trans, we admit that there's not necessarily a meaningful difference? What if our goal is not to minimize the numbers of trans people, but to facilitate everyone's discernment of what they want and who they are? This is not a shortcut to a straightforward answer. I'm not, not saying, hand out hormone pills with school lunches. I'm saying we should engage with these profound and profoundly theological questions. Who are we? Who should we be? Where are our limits and limitations? How do we make decisions for ourselves and for those we're responsible for? These questions engage with theological anthropology, the area of theological inquiry concerning what it means to be human in light of our relationship with the divine. And the bad answers to these questions, ones that oversimplify, that shut down questioning, that repeat sameness, these are the answers that try to minimize risk, but wind up causing deep harm and minimizing our humanity. I'm not going to rehearse the whole history of theological anthropology here. How much time do we have? But human uniqueness has often been defined as a certain trait or capacity that humans possess. Reason, intelligence, moral sense, some elevated trait that is supposed to separate humans from the rest of creation, demonstrating how we alone are created in the image of God. In practice, this has often resulted in imposing hierarchies on human beings. The people who are farthest from both godliness and full humanity are those who are deemed to possess less of the capacity in question, less rationality, less moral sense, less intelligence. And because ultimately these are not actually measurable qualities, who we decide has less of them tends to line up with social and political prejudices. Humanity's greatest atrocities have been justified by judging the victims as not really human or as an inferior type of human, because they were considered incapable of accessing the fullness of the image of God. As Dr. Lamar Hardwick showed us so brilliantly in his keynote yesterday morning, the theological anthropology that allows you to impose hierarchies of worth on human beings, including hierarchies of race, of gender, this is fundamentally an ableist theology. Ableist theology measures us against a norm, an idealized image of what the human person should be, and finds us all wanting, yet some are inevitably found more wanting than others. I have just a little triangle here of ableist theological anthropology. So at the top, there's the ideal. The next layer, those who are closer to the ideal are considered more human, and those who are farther from the ideal are less human. This is true of our bodily abilities, where the idealized image is of a non-disabled body. It's true of our intellectual abilities, where the idealized image is a non-disabled mind. And it's true of our genders, where the idealized image is not transgender. So, just to recapitulate the argument so far, going sort of reverse order from what I've said. Sorry, this is another wordy slide. But ableist theology defines humanity through an idealized norm that imposes hierarchies of worth on those found wanting. It also does this with gender, limiting the scope of possibilities for who we can be and how we can live a good life. Just as ableism defines disabled lives as inherently inferior to non-disabled lives, it also defines transgender lives as inherently inferior to cisgender lives. By diminishing the scope of acceptable possibilities for gendered and bodily variation, this theology promotes an anxiety and fear that diminishes human flourishing. And it does this by deeming certain people incapable of knowing themselves or making decisions about their own lives. Or what I have on the slide is that ableist theology elevates the rational mind and the normative body as closer to God's plan, making all the rest of us farther away from God's design. It denies full personhood, which includes gendered self-determination, to anyone deemed cognitively impaired, especially children, disabled people, and mentally ill people. And this theology also views transness as a form of mental illness, deviance, and incapacity. So in my remaining time, I want to move to a more constructive theological argument to explain why we need everyone to be more open and generous about gender and also just about each other's humanity more generally. For this, I think we need to reframe these underlying notions of autonomy, of self-determination, cognitive function, or cognitive impairment. What if we start from disability-informed truths, things that we in this room already know very well? One, we are all already entangled, interdependent. And two, we are bodily, cognitively, and gender diverse, both collectively and within our own lives. Interdependence means that no one is fully autonomous. The completely independent, self-made individual who has complete mastery over himself, and let's be honest, it's usually himself, is a myth. This is not just a moral claim I'm making here, but a factual one. Without two people choosing to unite their DNA, I do not exist. Without people caring for me in my infancy, I do not survive. Without supply chains of food and medication, without public transit infrastructure, without the emotional support of my loved ones and the psychological support of my therapist, shout out to Mark, I am not standing in front of you today. We owe our being to each other. Yet at the same time, we are all individuals, we have real differences, and we must make space for these differences to bloom. One of the biggest ethical challenges in life is how to value self-determination appropriately while also recognizing the entanglement of these selves. Children confront us directly with this difficult yet crucial task. How do we braid together strands of dependence and independence into the web of interdependence? I can think of three important factors in navigating this, and I have another little illustration here. So one is recognizing who has historically been granted a degree of autonomy and who never or rarely has. That's really important to take into account when we're talking about entanglement. Some of us might need to step back a little from the autonomy we have always been granted and allow others to step up for the autonomy that they have never been granted. Second, we need to set some baseline boundaries, even within our entanglement. Everybody deserves to have personal space, a certain degree of ownership over their own body. Again, even as we recognize that we are entangled and we care for each other, we need those boundaries. And the third thing is taking seriously our situatedness in particular places within particular communities. Interdependence means that we use our varying strengths and capacities to meet each other's needs. The second gift of disability wisdom for an anti-ableist theology is the beauty of our diversity. So what I have on the slide here is inherent diversity, bodily, cognitive, and gender. The fact that we have different bodies with different abilities is what enables us to meet each other's access needs. You might not be able to run upstairs to quickly grab the item you need, but I can do that for you. I might be having a really bad depressive episode, and you can help talk me through that. When we elevate a single type of body as the ideal body, we devalue the multiplicity of ways in which human beings are incarnated, and we dismiss the very place in which we show our devotion and care for each other. Our differences, our diversity, that's what makes relationality possible. Similar to bodily diversity, cognitive diversity means that we reject hierarchies of worth based on a norm of cognitive function, and instead embrace a whole range of cognitive ability as part of the full spectrum of humanity. The normative definition of cognitive impairment takes for granted that there is a norm of cognitive function, an accepted, widely agreed upon level of reasoning and decision-making from which deviation is considered impairment. But what is that norm? How do we measure it? Perhaps we need to admit that this norm is a fiction. We are cognitively variable within our own lives, depending not only on our age and developmental stage, but also how tired or drunk or caffeinated we might be at this very moment. And we are cognitively diverse collectively as a species and within our communities. When we exclude people with intellectual disabilities, we diminish the fullness of our community's humanity. And that means that we have to rise to the challenge of facilitating cognitively impaired people's participation in decision-making for themselves and their communities. And this includes facilitating their access to different ways of being gendered, including the possibility of transitioning. Those who want to ban transition-related medical care from the people they deem cognitively impaired may see themselves as safeguarding a vulnerable population. But what they are really doing is imposing a singular vision on people with a variety of needs. Everyone who expresses an interest in living as a different gender deserves individualized support in figuring out what is the right path for them, and a safe and loving community to provide that support. As with bodily diversity and cognitive diversity, embracing gender diversity means acknowledging and making space for a reality that already exists. Even among people who are not transgender, there's a great variety of different ways that gender is experienced. The meanings of maleness and femaleness vary in different cultures, different subcultures, different time periods, as well as among individuals within those cultures, affected by race, sexuality, disability, and other aspects of social location. I recently received a vivid example of how the meanings of gender change from a student in my Intro to Philosophy class in the fall. I had been explaining the long history of sexism, and the tradition, going back at least as far as the ancient Greeks, that associates women with the body and inferiority, and men with the mind and superiority. I described how women were long seen as intellectually incapable compared to men, and how in early modern Europe, there was a whole woman question, where it was seriously debated to what extent was it even worth bothering to educate women, since it might hinder them from their true purpose of mothering and reproducing the race. And anyway, were their little lady brains even capable of higher learning at all? One of my students raised his hand to express his astonishment. He had never heard any of this. As an 18-year-old in 2023, his experience of gender and education was that girls consistently do better than boys, and that there's a bit of an ongoing crisis about boys are not succeeding academically. How things have changed. I would even argue that an individual's gender doesn't stay the same throughout their life. A young woman and an old woman are both women, but womanhood has very different meanings for them, both socially and bodily. Or consider the many differences between your body as it was when you were a prepubescent child and your body now as an adult. I think it's barely an exaggeration to call puberty a kind of universal gender transition. And I wonder if this framing might help ease some of the cultural anxiety around the specter of a child taking puberty blockers and then, as a teenager, taking exogenous hormones to undergo medical transition. From conception to death, our bodies are in constant transition. Using medication to guide your body in the general direction you want it to go perhaps shouldn't be as controversial as it is. So, guided by these anti-ableist commitments to interdependence and the inherent goodness of diversity, I want to suggest a little model for how we can live out being the image of God relationally. This model involves the dynamic interaction of three elements, which I have on my slide as connected by two-way triangles. These are informed consent, openness to the unknown, and an accepting community of love and support. Rather than a trait that you can possess, like rationality or intelligence, I suggest that these elements together constitute our flourishing humanity in the image of God. None of them are inherent traits that some people possess more of than others. They are all practices, things we have to do together. The language of informed consent comes directly from the context of medical transition. Instead of putting you through an arduous and extremely lengthy process of detailed psychological evaluation, many providers have moved to an informed consent model, where the effects of hormones are explained to you, and you take them if you agree that this is what you want. The informed consent model demystifies the steps of medically transitioning, providing some knowledge of how bodies work that I think everyone could use. I once explained to a surprised cisgender friend that testosterone causes male pattern baldness, and so trans men who take testosterone are just as likely to lose their hair as cis men are. He himself was bald, but no one had seen the need to tell him that it was testosterone that activated his genetic predisposition toward baldness. Informed consent as a principle should be widely applied in society. It's what enables us to make decisions with the best information we have available to us. However, informed consent isn't full knowledge of the future. There are still unknowns. The informed consent form listing the effects of hormones includes a lot of mays and mights. You are accepting the possibility of going bald, but you can't foresee with certainty whether it will happen or when. And even if you've had many years of hormones and a paternal preview of your potential future, it is still a bit of a shock to realize that your luscious locks are starting to thin a bit. Trust me on this. Something you absolutely cannot predict is how transitioning will make you feel. Some people start hormones and feel right. Other people start them, realize this isn't for them, and they stop. Neither of these outcomes is bad. A bad outcome is not being able to start hormones when you want them, or feeling unable to stop taking hormones when you don't want to take them anymore, or not having the freedom to explore your gender at all. Openness to the unknown means openness to risk, openness to possibilities that cannot be foreseen. Openness to the unknown goes hand in hand with informed consent. Both are necessary for decision-making. And equally necessary for decision-making is a supportive community. It takes work to become informed, it takes work to stay open to the unknown, and it takes work to seek balance between the two. And this work is made possible within a community that accepts you for who you are and wants to help you become your best self. A transgender child has a lot of complicated choices ahead of them. How will they start socially transitioning? Will they medically transition? In what ways? On what timeline? There are no one-size-fits-all answers. In order to find the answers that are right for them, they need a community that will love them wholeheartedly, no matter what. All children need and deserve the safety of a supportive community that will help them to ask the right questions, explore potential answers, and find what they need to thrive. Jewish tradition has a long history of attempting to live out this model of being in the image of God. As the children of Israel, the Jewish people have a history of being a community engaged in rich, generative, sometimes generous discussion about how to live together. There's a famous story in the Talmud, the massive collection of rabbinic discussion and debate about Jewish law and practice, where the rabbis are debating a fine point of Jewish law. It's something about the ritual purity or impurity of a specific oven, classic rabbinic discussion. One rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, is convinced that he has the right answer, but he just can't persuade the others. He uses logic and reason, but the other rabbis reject his argument. He invokes miracles, making a tree walk around and a river flow backward. If I'm right, this tree will walk. If I'm right, this river will flow backward, and they do it. But the other rabbis reject these proofs. What does a tree have to do with whether or not an oven is ritually impure? Finally, he says, if I'm right, heaven will prove it. Sure enough, the voice of God speaks from heaven to say, Rabbi Eliezer is right. You might think that this would suffice to convince the other rabbis, but instead, they reject God's voice. They essentially say, God, you gave us your Torah. That was your job. Now it's our job to interpret it. Leave us to it. And how does God respond? We're told, God smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. I take this to mean that God loves our communal decision-making processes in all their messiness. When we work through complicated ideas together as a community, when we argue passionately for our positions and refuse to accept an oversimplified singular decree from a domineering voice on high, that's how we continue God's work. That's when God is delighted in us. Like the children of Israel, children in general do not conform to our expectations, and they cannot be confined to the straightforward boxes we sometimes want to put them in. Children are not the private property of their parents. They are not an overweening symbol of society's future or humanity's future. They are not an investment for your personal future. They are not passive dolls that you can play dress up with. They are strange, idiosyncratic, growing, changing little people. People with needs, desires, the requirement for support, but also the right to forge their path in the world. Like the blossoming onion layers of the Talmudic text, we provide them with the traditions that we have handed down, the traditions of gender and traditions of religion. We provide them with these traditions and the arguments that previous generations have had over these traditions. Their role is to enter into these arguments themselves. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk, and for a novice in this area, I wanted to just get some background on any concerns that we might have about children. I'm not sure the percentage who go through surgery. And then I think I've heard of studies where 32 or even higher want to, as you say, detransition and go back, and what the impact of surgery, that on children might be for the future. That's one thing. And then just intellectually, I'm just trying to find out in this space how the ability to have surgery to then conform to something that you want, how that sits with somebody who's autistic or deaf and who might want to change, but there's no medical thing, but rather they embrace who they are as they believe God has made them, and they ask for a communal love that you've been talking about. So I'm just interested in how surgery, which helps somebody to become, which may actually be a means to go into this ableist mindset actually that we have, and how we square that with somebody who has, who's born with a profound disability, as my son is, and who might want to go through surgery but doesn't, and he accepts. Maybe I've said that's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. With regard to surgery happening on children, it is very, very rare. The vast majority of people who get transition surgeries are over 18. And it's kind of interesting, there have been some big controversies. There was one in the UK with Kira Bell was a person who transitioned and then detransitioned and sued the gender clinic. And she actually was over 18 when she had her surgery. So I think sometimes people are sort of fuzzing the boundaries a bit, and I do think it's an oversimplification to say that, well, when you're under 18, you can't possibly make decisions for yourself, and as soon as you turn 18, it's totally up to you and you're completely responsible. It sort of goes against a lot of what I've been arguing in this talk, but it is sort of our legal standard, I guess, for adulthood. So it doesn't happen a lot on children. Occasionally, I think when it does, it tends to be children who have persistently, throughout pretty much their entire life up to that point, expressed the desire. Certainly, I think it's something where there would have to be a lot of care, a lot of community, involvement from the parents and the medical professionals to ensure that the child understands and that this is what they want. It's definitely not something to be undertaken lightly, but I don't think it is. And sometimes people run to that in the attempt to make a moral panic, like, oh, they're performing surgeries on children. It's like they're generally not. There are still surgeries performed on intersex children, sometimes these so-called normalizing surgeries, if they're born with ambiguous genitalia, trying to make them look more normal. That is something I think we should contest, but I think it is different from somebody requesting surgery for themselves. But I think this question of how does it relate to sort of self-acceptance, conformity to ableist norms is a really complicated one. I think sometimes people want to say, here are all the things that are to do with transitioning gender, and they're in their own category, and all the other ways you might want to modify your body are in a completely different category. And I think that can be politically useful sometimes, but I don't really think it's accurate. How do we draw this? If there's somebody who, a cisgender woman, and she's very unhappy with her breasts and she wants surgery to change how her breasts look, is that really so different from a trans person who wants to change their body medically? It's perhaps coming from a different place, but I think there are important conversations to be had about how do we think about that? Do we say it's entirely your choice? I mean, with cosmetic surgery in general, there's a lot of conversations about this. Where does the desire come from? Is it something that sort of society's norms have implanted in you, or is it something that comes from deep in yourself? And again, I don't know if this is necessarily a helpful way to think about it. Again, all of our desires they come from within us, but are also shaped by the world around us. I think a lot of it is about equipping people with the tools to sort of do this deep work in themselves and think seriously about, is this really what I want? And I think part of the problem with our current models is they don't necessarily facilitate that. I was talking to somebody who works with transgender youth, and he was saying that I see some of them and they just get so fixated on, here are the steps I need to, I've been given this list of things I have to do by the doctor and the surgeon. I have to meet each step along the way in order to get the surgery. And it leaves them no time to actually think seriously about, do I want this? What will it actually mean for my body? What will it feel like? So I think it sometimes ends up being counterproductive, the way that when we put in these really strict criteria that are kind of one size fits all, that you have to meet this requirement and this requirement and this requirement. Then people get so fixated on fulfilling the requirements, it doesn't actually let them think seriously about what they really want for themselves. So I guess the answer is I don't have a good answer, but I think what we need is kind of more conversation about it, more openness to having that discussion. And there's a brilliant book by Eli Clare. He's a disabled transgender man, and it's called Brilliant Imperfection. And a lot of it is him engaging with exactly these questions. He's thinking about, well, I have surgically altered my body in order to transition, but I also have worked really hard to love my disabled body as it is. And so how do I think about that? Which parts of my body do I change? Which parts of my body do I learn to love as they are? And he takes that really seriously and engages with it deeply. So again, it's Eli Clare, and the book is called Brilliant Imperfection.
Just to continue, how do you comment on, or could you comment on the fact that the percentage who want to go back, and you mentioned your own friend, I think, you've lost count of how many times he's gone back. And how do we conceptualize that in terms of people who are disabled and who don't have the ability to go back and forth like that? I'm just struggling with that.
Yeah, I think that is really complicated, and I think part of what we need to do for that is, it's partly about listening to people, but also about having those conversations with people, making sure that they understand what it is they're asking for. But I also think on some level, what we need to do is kind of destigmatize going back and forth. Obviously, it gets complicated when we're talking about things like surgeries that sometimes are irreversible or cannot be undone without a lot of difficulty. But I think in general, I think we need to make it less of a big deal. I think sometimes if somebody says, I want to change my gender, it sort of feels like, okay, now you're stuck with the new one. We should have that openness that you don't have to be stuck with the new one. You can be, if you are, that's great for you, but there are more options. But yeah, definitely, I think part of this is about, it also gets into this question of how are we communicating with disabled people, how are we meeting their needs and their wants, which again, not an easy question, and I'm sure that's something you personally have more experience with. Yeah.
Thank you, Max. I did it very enlighteningly, and I can't wait to. I'm sure this will become a book. I can't wait to read it because this is needed. As someone who is straight but who has gotten a lot of permission to be myself from the queer community that I hang out with in my church, because they can be bullied who they are, and they are wanting to be, and they let me be who I bully am. I am wondering, as someone who is operating both Christian and Jewish background, how do we, reclaim the narrative around like what is allowed, like what is Christian? I mean more the naturalistic religion than more what happens in the church. But how do we reclaim the dialogue and said that, for me, I am struggling with some of my more conservative friends who are like, there is Christian, there is not. And then me being that I'm a Christian because I love my neighbors as myself. How do we, so I'm just curious, have you thought about how do we shift that narrative naturally to be, that would accept the disabled and the queer and the trans bodies? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I don't know, I guess my answer would be that people are already doing this and sort of like support them. Like there are plenty of queer and disabled Christians and Jews and members of other faith communities, and they are living this, they're writing about their experiences, they're sharing them. And I think just kind of having that, embracing it, uplifting it, and sort of showing it to people who sort of think that seems like an impossibility to me, is what makes it visible. And I do think some people are inevitably going to double down and say, nope, we have to draw this boundary. You don't belong in this community. But the communities, it's happening. These people are thriving and they're flourishing and they're creating these communities together. So I think some of it is just bringing more attention to that and saying, actually, this is happening, whether you personally like it or not.
Hi, this is Ian Lash talking. I have just a couple of thoughts. First, I want to say thank you so much for your talk. I am the parent of 2 young children, and it's always remarkable how the world doesn't treat them as human, and what a surprise it is to find out that they are. I just wanted to, one thought that occurred to me, my oldest son, among other disabilities, has what's known as strabismus, so the pupils of his eyes don't align. There is a corrective surgery for that, which he has undergone once. It has about an 80% success rate, meaning it's not guaranteed to work. And what they told us when we opted for the surgery the first time was, it's an 80% success rate every time. So if it doesn't work the first time, you can do it again. And if it doesn't work that time, you can do it again. We don't say, because that surgery doesn't immediately achieve its intended effect, we don't do that surgery, right? And yet, that's because it is, the intent behind it is getting us closer to that idealized body that you mentioned, right? So there are ways in which we already accept surgeries that might have to be done multiple times, right? As long as they fit in our frameworks. So that's just a thought I wanted to share, but I do have a question regarding particularly the conception of the image of God. This is where I'm working, and so it's of interest to me. And I was wholeheartedly on board when you laid out the idea of the image of God. The closer we are to whatever that ideal of the image of God, the more willing we are to recognize the humanity of people. My question is, and this is, I don't mean for this to be contentious, but I just do want to ask this. When you have this final slide about being the image of God, my question is it possible that we've set up something that is similar in that the degree to which we perform what's up here determines the degree to which we are actually reflecting or mirroring the image of God to the world? And the reason that's pertinent, or the reason that that's a salient question for me, is one of the things that you have up there is openness to the unknown, which I agree with in theory, but I'm also autistic, so like I'm not capable of that to the same degree of that other people might be, right? So that's where it's coming from, and just wondering if you've thought about how we can have a performative aspect of the image of God as you set it up that doesn't allow for some people to be more or less in the image, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. I think it's really important. Molly Haslam has this great book that's like a constructive theology of intellectual disability, and she sort of gets at exactly this point where she's talking about how a lot of the theologians of disability talk about this idea that instead of having it be a trait or capacity, the image of God is relation, but sometimes they end up treating relation as a form of capacity or trait that some people have less of. And so the way that she talks about it is that when she's talking about responsive relationality, I think is the term she uses, for her it's not about that as an ideal, but it's about the actual practice of that being worked out in relationships with people. And I was trying to go for something a bit like that with this. I was thinking of openness. I know there are some people who talk about openness to the unknown as sort of this, as a trait that some people have more of or less of, but I was really thinking of it more in terms of a practice, something that you can cultivate kind of through conversations with others, through learning, that it's partly about, here are my plans for the future, and somebody says, well, what about X, Y, or Z? What might happen there? But yeah, it's definitely a risk, and I appreciate you bringing that point up, because it is important.
Hi, this is Latia. I have a question around, trying to figure out how to word this question, so when you have intersecting identities and you're in a community where one might say you already are oppressed in these different ways. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, so when you have intersecting identities and you experience maybe triple oppression and then an additional one perhaps. So talking around that, how this can be helpful in those spaces that are not white spaces, right? Having this conversation. And then in terms of, because I've heard people say if one is transitioning from female to male, that it is in some way moving up on that hierarchical ladder, right? That maybe you won't experience misogyny in some senses, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing those things up. I think, this is something I'm working with in an ongoing way, and I can envision it being something that, multiple communities can work through it in different ways. And I think certainly, Black people need their communities where they can just get away from white people for a second. And I think also we all need to be in community with each other and learn from each other, but also people who are more oppressed do need to have those spaces where they can take a break. And so maybe it's, I've got just the one triangle here, but it could be multiple sort of overlapping triangles. And yeah, in terms of sort of going up the hierarchy, it's certainly true that there are ways that transitioning to male, especially if you are someone who is consistently seen as male, which is not always the case, there are certainly ways that you experience those privileges in the world. I think it's a question of what do you do with them? And some people really embrace it. There are really toxic masculinity is a problem among transgender men, for sure. And I kind of think that we all have an obligation to try and recognize those things and dismantle them. And in some ways, it might make you more aware of it, and hopefully you'll do some good with that.
So a couple of things. One is you're talking about mental health issues preventing transition, but most of the people I have seen in counseling who have mental health issues who want to transition have that. They're not allowed to be themselves, so they're having stress and trauma reactions to the society, and their mental health issue is actually related to stress and trauma from how society is, and that puts you in that loop about you can't take the train if you can't get downstairs. You can't reclaim your mental health if society doesn't accept you, and that is kind of a loop that I see in working with that population. But something else I just kind of want to ask about is kind of how indigenous people often see 5 genders. And I'm wondering kind of if we recognized more men who felt like women, women who felt like men, and twin spirits even with transitioning, maybe a man who feels like a woman decides they want to be a woman who feels like a man, and they kind of like that. And kind of getting back to kind of basic how people are, that gender is not really binary, it's many categories, and how that fits into all of this.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. I think that it's definitely true that colonialism from Europe has been a big part of kind of imposing this model of strictly two genders on a lot of parts of the world. And there are a lot of indigenous and decolonial communities who are kind of reclaiming and recreating ancestral forms of gender diversity. And I also really appreciate you naming the the causality of mental health, that it is often living in a transphobic society or living as a closeted person that can be the big cause of a lot of people's mental health struggles.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Emma Cerruti, and I really enjoyed your presentation. It got me thinking a lot also of intersection of fat bodies along with other like race and gender, queerness, disability. I was wondering if you could speak more to that, especially about how as theologians, practitioners of faith, what we can do to help speak to medical communities, professionals about this intersection. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's really important. I was just reading something the other day that some studies they've done, they found that sort of people's implicit bias and stigma against most groups has sort of been gradually diminishing over the year, but fat phobia really hasn't. It just, like, we're still really, really fat phobic, even though we obviously are still all those other things as well, but it doesn't seem to be changing. And certainly that intersects particularly with trans health. There are a lot of surgeons who have weight requirements for surgeries, and a lot of times these are perhaps scientifically dubious, let's say. It feels like every week I'm seeing another trans person being like, I have to get my BMI below a certain level before I can get my surgery, like what can I do? And I think there was recently a study showing that you really don't need to, like demonstrating what kind of knew that this is not necessary. But yeah, I think this idea of it ties into this idea of sort of embracing different bodies, recognizing the goodness, kind of rejecting that ideal. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important. And I think there are also interesting ways that sometimes, not always, but at least in some circumstances, people with fat bodies are gendered in certain ways. I think particularly we've got more and more this idea of like in pop culture, we're constantly seeing like all the male action movie stars just like ridiculously ripped, and it tends to perpetuate this idea that if you are a little round and soft, that you are not a real man in some ways. So I think that's also an interesting part of it.
Hi. Thank you for the work. It's very important, and I hope it's disseminated far and wide. I have a question that may be based in naivete. I was not aware that being autistic was something that could either culturally or medically or legally discount someone who wanted to transition. And as we know, many people in the autism community are trans or gay, or there's a lot of creativity around gender in that community. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm just wondering what that's based in and how it plays out. I simply hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, so there are, I think part of the anxiety that people are saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't let autistic people transition, comes directly from that, the fact that autistic people are more likely to be trans than non-autistic people, and some people see that and immediately think this is a problem, something needs to be done about it. And there are theories as to why it is. One of the theories is that autistic people in general are less likely to follow social norms that they don't see a point to, and that includes gender norms, and so they're more likely to have a little bit of freedom. I like that framing because it suggests to me that actually maybe a lot more non-autistic people could be more gender diverse than they are if they weren't kind of like suppressing that part of themselves to fit in with social gender norms. But I think the anxiety definitely comes from this idea a stereotypical image of autistic people as sort of, incapable of thinking for themselves, and particularly that they could be swayed, they're too easily swayed by others. That, they see something, they see a YouTuber who talks about being trans, and they sort of glom onto that and say, okay, I'm trans now. And this fear that, again, that they are too easily persuadable. I think that's sort of where it comes from, sort of this, I guess this social thing of viewing autistic people as disabled, as childlike, as incapable in so many ways. And the fear is particularly acute in the social panic, I guess, about girls. And I think part of that is sexism again, this idea that as girls they know, kind of goes back to the idea that they can know themselves less, but this big fear that autistic girls can be misled into thinking that they're trans. But it's interesting, these people who worry about this never worry about it the other way. What if an autistic trans person is being misled into thinking they're cis? That's never a concern. I think that's interesting.
I've been sitting here trying to think about ways that I would enter this conversation. I mean, I appreciate helping me understand some things that I didn't know. But it also goes, and it's just not directly related at all. I mean, but just a comment. More than 30 years ago, maybe 40, I don't know how many at this point, I got a vasectomy. I altered my body. Nobody challenged that. Nobody said anything. And probably, according to some people, I was doing something negative to the temple of God, or who a male person was supposed to be. And it just struck me that kind of thing maybe hasn't entered the conversation yet. We talk a lot about, of course, women's control over their bodies and anybody else's, but in terms of men, they don't get that same kind of question and challenge. Just a comment.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and that's one of the things, I guess it didn't really come much into this talk, but it's one of the things I'm really interested in thinking about this intersection of trans and disabilities, this question of, well, which modifications to bodies do we treat as unexceptional? Which ones do we treat as sort of normal or desirable or good? Which ones do we say that's entirely your choice? And which ones do we say, no, something, there's additional meaning to that, or other people get a say in that? And that's a great example, so thank you for that.
And the other comment about that is I've probably thought about that 10 times since it happened. It's not in front of me every day like somebody challenging something. It's just never impacted anything.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone.